The wind was screaming at 60 knots when Corporal Sarah Vance placed her eye against the scope and stopped breathing. Below her, cutting through the white curtain of snow that had tried to kill her for 6 straight days, 23 vehicles were crawling through the canyon. 23. She counted them twice. Then a third time because her mind refused to accept what her eyes were seeing. 300 enemy personnel, 2 light armored cars, a full mechanized column pushing through a route that every map in the theater of operations had declared impassable for 40 years. And between that column and the undefended rear positions of Rally Point Theta, 80 miles to the east, there was exactly one obstacle. Her. Sarah's finger rested against the trigger. 3 pounds of pressure. That was all it would take. 3 pounds. And she would announce her position to an enemy force that outnumbered her 300 to 1. 3 pounds. And she would almost certainly die on this frozen ridge, alone, forgotten, in a post that had been deleted from the operational maps 2 weeks ago. She could stay silent. No one would ever know. No one would ever blame her. The post didn't exist. She didn't exist. Not anymore. But as she stayed silent, that column would pour through the northern canyon like water through a broken dam. They would hit the supply lines first, then the field hospitals, then the rear command positions where no one was expecting an attack, because no one believed an attack from this direction was possible. Thousands of soldiers, thousands of lives. Against her one. Sarah Vance exhaled, and she made her choice. If that opening hooked you, stay with me. This story only gets more intense. Subscribe now for more real stories of courage, and hit that notification bell. Drop a comment and tell me where you're listening from. Now, let me take you back to where it all began. 8 days before Sarah lay in the snow with a rifle and an impossible decision. The order came down on March 14th at 0647 hours, and it came down wrong. Lieutenant Webb stood in the center of Outpost November-Seven with a radio handset pressed to his ear, his face cycling through confusion, then frustration, then the flat acceptance of a man who had learned long ago that arguing with battalion command was about as useful as arguing with the weather. Private Hoskins was already packing his gear before Webb had finished the transmission. Sarah sat on an ammunition crate by the observation window, her rifle across her knees, watching the exchange without speaking. She already knew what was coming. She had known for 2 days, ever since the primary offensive had kicked off 80 miles east and command had started cannibalizing every available body for the main effort. November 7th was not available. November 7th was, according to the last updated operational map she had seen, a decommissioned observation post slated for full abandonment within 30 days. It didn't have a garrison anymore. It had 3 soldiers who had been temporarily assigned to monitor a canyon approach that hadn't seen enemy activity since before any of them were born. 3 soldiers. Now 2. Now 1. Webb set down the radio and looked at Sarah for a long moment. His face said everything his mouth wasn't willing to say. He was a good officer. Not brilliant, not ambitious, but solid. The kind of lieutenant who remembered his soldiers' names and made sure they had enough socks. He didn't want to do this. Vance, sir, command is pulling me and Hoskins to the eastern push. Transport's inbound in 40 minutes. Sarah nodded slowly. She had expected this. What she hadn't expected was the next part. They're leaving you here. Here, sir. Alone. They want eyes on the northern canyon until they can get a replacement element up here. Could be 3 days. Could be 5. Depends on how the offensive plays out. Sarah looked around the outpost. Stone walls. A single reinforced observation position. 1 auxiliary radio, 1 backup, 1 emergency beacon. Solar panels that worked when it wasn't snowing. A stove that burned through fuel like a drunk burns through whiskey. Sir, she said carefully, if something happens to comms. I know. Webb's jaw tightened. I've already flagged it with command. They've noted my concerns. Noted. The word hung in the air like a bad smell. Noted meant ignored. Noted meant someone in a warm office 80 miles away had checked a box on a form and gone back to their coffee. You're the best shot in the battalion, Webb continued. That's why they're keeping you here. If anything comes through that canyon, you're the one who can do something about it. Sarah wanted to ask what exactly one sniper was supposed to do against any force large enough to actually threaten the sector, but she kept her mouth shut. She knew the answer. The answer was nothing. One sniper against a real threat was a speed bump, a footnote, a 3-second delay before the enemy rolled over a position and kept moving. But that wasn't what battalion command was thinking about. They were thinking about the offensive. They were thinking about the Eastern Front, where the real war was happening, where bodies and bullets and war meals were being funneled in an endless stream, because that was where victory or defeat would be decided. November 7th was an afterthought, a checkbox on a form someone had noted and forgotten. "Understood, sir," Sarah said. Webb hesitated. For a moment, he looked like he wanted to say something else, something human, something that acknowledged the fundamental wrongness of leaving a soldier alone in a position 9,400 feet up a frozen ridge with winter coming in hard and fast. But the transport was 40 minutes out, and there were bags to pack, and orders were orders. "Good luck, Vance." "You too, sir." Hoskins paused by the door on his way out. He was young, 22, the kind of soldier who still wrote letters home every week and got excited about care packages. He looked at Sarah with something that might have been guilt. "We'll be back before you know it," he said. Sarah almost smiled. "Almost." "Sure you will, Hoskins. Don't get shot. Don't freeze." And then they were gone, and the helicopter was a fading thump against the gray sky, and Corporal Sarah Vance was alone on a ridge that God had forgotten. She spent the first 2 hours after their departure conducting a full inventory of everything in the outpost. It was a habit she had developed years ago, back when she was new to battalion, and her sergeant had drilled into her that knowing your resources was the difference between surviving and dying stupid. 200 rounds of precision ammunition across 8 magazines, 1 sidearm with 4 magazines, 6 flares for the launcher, 11 meals in the ration box, medical kit, sleeping bag, and a logbook that no one would ever read. She checked the radios. Primary, functional. Auxiliary, functional. Emergency beacon, green light, ready to transmit. She checked the solar panels. Clear, angled correctly. Charging the backup batteries. She checked the stove, the fuel reserves, the water supply. Everything was fine. Everything was operational. 3 days, maybe 5. She could do that in her sleep. The blizzard hit 31 hours later. It didn't arrive gradually. One moment Sarah was watching the canyon through her scope, tracking a family of mountain goats that had wandered into her field of view, and the next moment the world disappeared. The wind came first. Not a gust, not a building pressure, but a wall of moving air that hit the outpost like a freight train and didn't stop. The stone walls groaned. The observation slits whistled. The temperature, which had been hovering around 15 degrees, plunged like a stone thrown off a cliff. Sarah scrambled for the radio. November 7th to Forward Base Charlie, over. Static, not the clean static of an open channel, but the thick, choking static of atmospheric interference powerful enough to shred electromagnetic signals like paper. She tried again, and again, and again. Nothing. The auxiliary radio was worse. She couldn't even get static, just a high-pitched whine that made her teeth ache. Sarah stood in the center of the outpost and listened to the blizzard screaming against the walls. And for the first time since Webb and Hoskins had left, she felt the cold weight of real fear settling into her chest. 3 days, maybe 5, they had said. That was the timeline. That was the plan. But plans didn't mean anything when the world was trying to kill you. She spent the first night of the storm huddled by the stove, feeding it fuel in careful, measured amounts, running calculations in her head. Fuel reserves would last 8 days at current consumption. Rations would last 11 days if she cut back to half portions. Water wasn't a problem. She had snow for that, more snow than she could ever use. The problem was the radios. The problem was that no one could hear her, and no one knew she was in trouble, and no one was coming. By the second day, the solar panels were buried under 6 inches of powder, and the backup batteries were at 40%. Sarah suited up, wrapped herself in every layer she could find, and spent 20 minutes in the howling dark trying to clear the panels with her bare hands. When she came back inside, her fingers were white and her face was numb, and the batteries had gained maybe 5% charge. Not enough. Nowhere near enough. By the 3rd day, she stopped trying to reach Forward Base Charlie. The auxiliary radio had died completely, a victim of the cold or the interference or simple bad luck. The primary was still functional, but it couldn't punch through the storm, and draining the batteries on futile transmission attempts was a luxury she couldn't afford. She tried the emergency beacon. One press of the button. One single red blink. Then nothing. Sarah stared at the dead beacon for a long time. She was methodical about these things. She checked the connections. She checked the battery. She checked the indicator lights. Everything was correct. Everything was in order. The beacon was simply dead. She set it down carefully, walked to the observation slit, and looked out at the white void beyond. Alone, abandoned, forgotten. The word that kept coming back to her was erased. Not killed, not lost, but erased. November 7th had been removed from the operational maps. Her garrison had been reduced to 1. Her communications were dead. In every way that mattered to the military bureaucracy that had put her here, she no longer existed. If she died on this ridge, no one would find her for weeks, maybe months, maybe never. If the snow buried the outpost deep enough, she would become a mystery, a footnote, a question mark in someone's personnel file. Last known location, classified, status, missing, presumed dead. Sarah had always prided herself on her ability to stay calm under pressure. It was what made her the battalion's best sniper. The ability to slow her heart rate on command, to find the stillness between breaths, to make her hands steady when every instinct was screaming at her to shake. But there was a difference between pressure and despair. Pressure was a shot at 1,800 yards, with wind gusting at 30 knots. Pressure was a target that was moving, a window that was closing, a margin of error measured in inches. Despair was knowing that no one was coming, that no one even knew she needed them to come, that she was going to die slowly, alone, in a stone box that the world had forgotten. On the 4th day, Sarah stopped eating full rations. On the 5th day, she started talking to herself. It wasn't crazy. Not yet. It was simple human need, the basic requirement of a social species to hear a voice, even if that voice was her own. She narrated what she was doing. She asked herself questions and answered them. She held entire conversations with people who weren't there, practicing what she would say to Webb when he came back, what she would tell the debrief officers at battalion command, what she would write in her letters home. Except there was no one to write home to. Not anymore. That was one of the reasons she had volunteered for November 7th in the first place, back when it still had a 3-person garrison and a functioning supply line. No family, no obligations, nothing but the rifle and the scope and the quiet satisfaction of being the best at something. The best. That was what Webb had said. You're the best shot in the battalion. Sarah almost laughed. What good was being the best shot in the battalion when there was nothing to shoot at? When the only enemy was the cold and the wind and the terrible, crushing weight of knowing that she was going to die. She checked her rifle anyway. She checked it every morning and every night, the same routine she had followed since the first day of her training. Clean the barrel, check the action, count the ammunition. 200 rounds, 8 magazines, more than enough to fight a small war, more than enough to do absolutely nothing against a blizzard. On the evening of day 5, the storm paused, not stopped, not ended, just paused, like a predator catching its breath before the final strike. Sarah was at the observation slit when it happened. She had been watching the white void for so long that her eyes had started playing tricks on her, creating shapes where there were none, shadows where there was only snow. But this was not a trick. This was a sound. Low, mechanical, familiar, engines, diesel engines, multiple vehicles moving through deep snow. Sarah grabbed her rifle and pressed her eye to the scope. The magnification was set to maximum 12 power, and she swept the canyon below with practiced precision. Nothing. White on white on white. The snow was still falling, though lighter now, and the visibility was maybe half a mile instead of 50 feet she had been dealing with for 5 days. But she could hear them. Engines growling, treads crunching, the unmistakable sound of a mechanized column forcing its way through terrain that should have been impassable. She adjusted her position. She checked the wind. She waited, and then the radio crackled. Sarah lunged for it, her heart hammering in her chest. The primary radio was still functional, still drawing power from the batteries, and the pause in the storm had opened a window in the interference. But the voice that came through was not speaking English, and the words were saying made her blood run cold. The transmission was fragmentary, chopped and distorted by residual interference, but Sarah had studied enough target language during her training to catch the essential meaning. All units converge. Rally point theta, northern approach, complete encirclement. She grabbed her logbook and wrote down every word she could decipher, her hand moving faster than her mind, the training taking over while her conscious thoughts raced to catch up. Rally point theta. That was 80 miles east. That was the primary defensive position anchoring the entire northern sector of the front. That was where Webb and Hoskins had been sent, along with every other warm body battalion command could scrape together. Northern approach. Northern approach. Sarah looked at the canyon below. The canyon that every operational map had marked as impassable for 40 years. The canyon that no one was watching because no one believed anyone could push a force through it. "Oh, God," she whispered. She pressed her eye back to the scope and swept the terrain again. Still nothing. But the engine sounds were getting louder, closer, and the transmission had been clear. All units converge. Complete encirclement. This was not a patrol. This was not a reconnaissance element. This was a flanking attack. The enemy had found a route that coalition forces had dismissed as impossible. They were pushing a mechanized column through the northern mountains, through the canyon that November 7th was supposed to be watching, toward the undefended rear positions of a defensive line that had no idea they were coming. And Sarah was the only person who knew. She tried the radio again. November 7th to forward base Charlie. November 7th to any station. This is a priority alert. Enemy mechanized column approaching through northern canyon. Estimated strength unknown. Repeat, enemy mechanized column approaching rally point theta from the north. Do you copy? Over. Static. She tried again, and again, and again. The pause in the storm was closing. The wind was picking up. The snow was thickening, and the window of clear transmission was slamming shut. Sarah screamed into the radio until her throat was raw, but no one answered. She was still alone, still forgotten, still erased. But now she had information that could decide the war. The first vehicles emerged from the snow at 1,623 hours. Sarah watched them through her scope, her body pressed flat against the observation position, her breathing slow and controlled despite the adrenaline flooding her system. APCs, troop transports, light armored cars. They crawled to the canyon at maybe 3 miles per hour, their engines straining against the deep snow, their lights cutting narrow beams through the white curtain. She counted them as they appeared. 1, 3, 7, 12, 15, 23. 23 vehicles carrying approximately 300 personnel, pushing through a route that the coalition had written off as impossible, heading toward a defensive line that had no idea they existed. Sarah ran the calculations in her head. Distance from her position to the canyon floor, approximately 1,800 yards at the current angle. Wind, 40 knots gusting to 60, with brief lulls every 30 to 40 seconds lasting 7 to 8 seconds each. Temperature, negative 20 Fahrenheit plus wind chill. Altitude, 9,400 feet, which would affect bullet trajectory in ways her standard tables didn't fully account for. Range to target, extreme. Conditions, impossible. Odds of making a meaningful shot, somewhere between 0 and laughable. She had 200 rounds. The convoy had 300 soldiers. If she fired, she would reveal her position to an overwhelming force with no support, no extraction, and no hope of survival. They would swarm the ridge. They would find her. They would kill her. If she didn't fire, the convoy would reach rally point theta in 6 hours. They would hit the supply lines, the field hospitals, the rear command positions. The defensive line would collapse. Thousands of soldiers would die because no one had seen them coming. Sarah's hands were shaking, not from the cold, from the weight of the choice. She thought about the beacon, the single red blink, the dead silence. She thought about the radio, the static, the messages that went nowhere. She thought about Webb and Hoskins, somewhere out there in the chaos, waiting for a flanking attack that would come out of nowhere and cut them down before they could react. There was no order, no authority, no command structure. There was just her and her rifle and her conscience. Sarah Vance had never believed in God. Not really. Not the way some soldiers did, the ones who prayed before missions and wore crosses around their necks and talked about heaven like it was a deployment they were looking forward to. But as she lay in the snow with her scope trained on a column that was about to destroy everything she had sworn to protect, she found herself whispering something that might have been a prayer. "Forgive me," she said, and then she started to prepare. The convoy reached her optimal engagement zone at 1,641 hours. Sarah had spent the intervening 18 minutes doing the most important work of her life. She had calculated wind deflection at 40 knots crosswind, 9 feet of lateral drift over 1,800 yards, plus an additional 2 feet for the quartering angle. She had calculated altitude and temperature compensation, 2 additional feet of drop beyond her standard tables. She had calculated target lead for vehicles moving at 3 miles per hour, 15 feet in the 2-second flight time of her bullet. She had identified her primary target, the command vehicle at the head of the column, identifiable by its antenna array and the flag mounted on its hood. Kill the command vehicle and you blind the snake. Kill the officers inside and you paralyze it. She had identified her backup targets, the lead armored car, the communications vehicle, the fuel trucks that were keeping the whole convoy moving. She had run the numbers until they were burned into her memory, until she could recite them in her sleep, until they had replaced the fear with something harder and colder. Now she waited. The wind was howling at 55 knots, 58, 60. The snow was horizontal, a white wall moving at highway speeds. But she had learned something during 5 days of watching the storm. The wind came in cycles. Fury, then stillness, then fury again. And in the stillness, in those brief windows of 7 to 8 seconds, a shooter with the right skills and the right position could make a shot that physics said was impossible. Sarah watched the command vehicle. She watched the wind indicators she had improvised from strips of cloth tied to exposed rocks. She watched the snow. 60 knots, 58, 55, 50, 45, 40. The wind dropped like a stone, and Sarah's world went silent. She found the command vehicle in her scope. She found the engine block, the thickest part of the target, the point where a single hit would disable the vehicle and trap every officer inside. Distance, 1,847 yards. She adjusted her elevation, 47 clicks. She felt the dial turn under her frozen fingers. She adjusted her windage, 23 clicks left, accounting for residual drift even in the low. She placed the crosshairs where the engine block would be when her bullet arrived, not where it was now. She took one breath, let it out, took another, let half of it out, held. Her heart rate dropped, 58 beats per minute. The stillness she had trained for years to achieve. 3 pounds of pressure. The rifle bucked against her shoulder. The bullet left the barrel at 2,800 feet per second. Sarah didn't watch it fly. She couldn't. The scope was already shifting. Her hands already moving to chamber the next round. Her mind already calculating the corrections for her second shot. But she heard it. 2 seconds after she pulled the trigger, she heard the distant crack of high-velocity impact, and through her scope she saw the command vehicle shudder and stop. Steam erupted from the hood. The engine block had taken the hit dead center. Oil and coolant sprayed across the snow as the vehicle's drivetrain seized and died. The convoy froze. For 3 precious seconds, nothing moved. The vehicles behind the command car stopped. The soldiers inside sat in confusion, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to process the impossible reality that something had reached out and touched them from almost 2 kilometers away. Sarah used those 3 seconds. Her scope swept to the driver's side door of the command vehicle. A figure was emerging, a man in officer's insignia, his face twisted with confusion and the first hints of fear. Distance, 1,920 yards now, as the vehicles had continued to crawl forward before stopping. Wind, still calm. She had maybe 4 seconds left in the low. She adjusted. 3 clicks elevation, 2 clicks windage. The crosshairs settled on the officer's upper chest. Sarah's finger took up the slack. 3 pounds. The rifle spoke. The officer spun and fell. The bullet had taken him high in the torso, the impact visible even at this distance. A spray of red against the white snow behind him. Not a kill, not with that trajectory and that wind, but a wound, a serious one, the kind that would require immediate evacuation, immediate medical attention, immediate chaos. Sarah chambered her 3rd round. The low was ending. She could feel it, the way a sailor feels a change in the wind before it arrives. The stillness was compressing. The air was tightening, and in seconds the 60-knot fury would return. She had one more shot. The second officer was smarter than the first. He had seen his commander fall. He was moving, scrambling for cover, trying to get behind the bulk of the disabled vehicle. But he was moving predictably, and Sarah had been shooting moving targets since she was 19 years old. Distance, 2,014 yards. Wind, rising 15 knots and climbing. She led him by 18 feet instead of 15. She added 2 more clicks of windage. She found the point in space where his center mass would intersect with her bullet's path. 3 pounds. The rifle bucked. For one eternal second, Sarah watched through her scope as the bullet flew. Then the officer's body jerked and crumpled, and he didn't get up. The wind roared back. The window slammed shut. And Sarah had exactly no time to celebrate because the convoy was waking up. Muzzle flashes erupted from a dozen positions. The soldiers were firing blind, spraying rounds in every direction, trying to suppress a threat they couldn't see and couldn't locate. Bullets cracked against the rocks below her position, but they were wild, unfocused, the panicked response of men who had just watched their command structure decapitated in 30 seconds. Sarah rolled away from the observation position. Her hands were shaking now. The adrenaline was catching up with her, the reality of what she had just done crashing over her like a wave. 3 shots. 2 officers down, 1 command vehicle disabled, and 300 soldiers who now knew exactly where she was. No, not exactly. The wind and the snow and the distance meant they couldn't pinpoint a location, but they knew she was on the ridge. They knew the general direction, and if they were smart, if whoever was now in command down there was smart, they would send teams up to find her and kill her. Sarah grabbed the flare launcher. She had 6 flares. She needed them to believe she wasn't alone. The first flare arced into the sky from her primary position, a brilliant red star burning through the snow and the darkness. Then she moved, 20 meters to the left, to the secondary position she had identified days ago, when she had nothing else to do but study the terrain. The second flare launched from there. Another move, 30 meters right, past her original position, to a shallow depression in the rock that offered marginal cover. The third flare, 20 meters back. The fourth flare, from the canyon below. She heard shouting. The soldiers were responding to the flares, trying to track the sources, seeing multiple launch points spread across a 100-meter frontage. One sniper could not cover that much ground and fire that quickly. Multiple shooters. That was what they would think. A defended position. A strong point with overlapping fields of fire and coordinated defensive arrangements. They didn't know that one woman was doing it all. Sarah returned to her primary observation position and pressed her eye back to the scope. The convoy was in chaos. Vehicles were turning, tried to reverse course in deep snow that fought their every movement. Soldiers were dismounting, taking cover behind anything solid, their weapons pointed at the ridge but their fire unfocused and ineffective. The command vehicle was still smoking. The wounded officer was being dragged to cover. The dead officer was lying where he had fallen, his blood already freezing in the snow. Sarah watched and waited. She had 2 flares left. She had 197 rounds. She had a position that was defensible for exactly as long as they didn't figure out that she was alone. The wind howled. The snow fell. The temperature continued to drop. And Sarah Vance, the battalion's best sniper, the garrison of a post that no longer existed, the woman who had been erased from every map and every roster, watched her impossible gamble play out below. The next 40 minutes were the longest of her life. The enemy commander, whoever had taken over after she had killed the second-in-command and wounded the commanding officer, was not a fool. He sent probing teams up the ridge, small groups of soldiers moving carefully through the snow, trying to locate her position without exposing themselves to fire. Sarah let them come. She didn't shoot. She couldn't afford to. Every shot she fired was a shot that revealed her position, and she had already pushed her luck further than physics should have allowed. Instead, she used the terrain. November 7th was wedged into a granite cliff face for a reason. The approach from below was brutal. Loose rock, deep snow, exposed ridgelines that channeled any attacker into narrow kill zones. A full platoon could have held this position against a company. A squad could have held it against a platoon. One sniper could not hold it against 300 soldiers. But one sniper could make them think it wasn't worth the cost. The probing teams reached the base of the main approach and stopped. They looked up at the ridge, at the stone walls barely visible through the snow, at the position that had somehow reached out and killed from 2 kilometers away. They didn't advance. Sarah understood why. The commander had to be weighing his options. His mission was to flank Rally Point Theta, to deliver a decisive blow against the coalition's rear positions. That mission required speed and surprise. Every hour he spent fighting for this ridge was an hour the coalition had to detect his approach and prepare a response. Was this position worth the casualties it would cost to take? Was one ridge worth 50 men? 100? Sarah watched the probing teams retreat. She watched the convoy begin to reform. She watched the disabled command vehicle being pushed off the road by one of the armored cars, its corpse shoved into a snowbank to clear the path. And she watched, with slowly dawning hope, as the convoy began to turn around. They were withdrawing, not attacking, not pushing forward. Withdrawing. The gamble had worked. Sarah's hands started shaking again. She pressed them against the frozen stone and forced herself to breathe, forced herself to stay still, forced herself to watch until the last vehicle disappeared back into the white void of the canyon. 23 vehicles, 300 personnel, turned back by one sniper, 3 bullets and 4 flares. Sarah didn't move for another hour. She stayed in position, her rifle ready, her scope sweeping the empty canyon, her body slowly freezing in the snow. Only when she was absolutely certain they were gone did she finally allow herself to retreat to the warmth of the outpost. The storm roared back to full fury that night. The wind hit 70 knots. The temperature dropped to 30 below. The world outside became a white hell that nothing could survive. Sarah sat by the stove and stared at her hands. She had won. She had actually won. Against impossible odds, against every calculation of logic and probability. She had turned back a flanking attack that could have decided the war, and no one would ever know. The radios were still dead. The beacon was still silent. The map still showed nothing where she sat. In every way that mattered to the world outside this frozen box, the engagement in the canyon had never happened. Sarah picked up her logbook. She stared at the blank page for a long time. There was so much she could write. The distances, the wind calculations, the moral agony of choosing to fire when staying silent would have been so much easier. The terror and the triumph and the strange, hollow feeling that came after. Instead, she wrote 6 words. Day 6. Convoy attempted northern approach. Repelled. SV. She closed the logbook and set it aside. Then she ate half a ration pack, wrapped herself in her sleeping bag, and slept for 14 hours straight. The storm broke on the morning of day 8. Sarah woke to something she had almost forgotten existed. Silence. Not the artificial silence of storm lows. Those brief pauses that lasted seconds before the wind returned. Real silence. The kind that came when the world had finished trying to kill you and was taking a breath before deciding what to do next. She crawled out of her sleeping bag and moved to the observation slit. Her body ached. Her joints popped. Her muscles had the weak, trembling quality of tissue that hadn't been properly fed or rested in over a week. But she was alive. And outside, the sun was rising. It came up over the eastern peaks in a blaze of orange and gold, painting the snow-covered landscape in colors so vivid they almost hurt to look at. The clouds were breaking apart, scattering before a high-pressure system that had finally, mercifully, pushed the blizzard east. Sarah looked down at the canyon. Empty, white, peaceful, no vehicles, no soldiers, no sign that 300 enemy personnel had ever pushed through that valley, had ever threatened the entire northern sector, had ever existed at all. The only evidence was a dark smear where the command vehicle had bled its fluids into the snow, and even that was half buried now. Just another shadow in a landscape full of shadows. Sarah checked the radio. Still static. The batteries were at 12%, barely enough to power the receiver, nowhere near enough to transmit. She checked the emergency beacon. Still dead. She looked at the solar panels, still buried under 2 feet of powder from the storm's final fury. It would take hours to dig them out. Hours she didn't have. The food was running out, and the fuel was running out, and if she waited for someone to find her, she would be waiting forever. November 7th didn't exist anymore. No one was coming. If she wanted to live, she would have to walk out. Sarah spent 2 hours preparing. She packed everything she could carry, the remaining rations, 8 meals, her sidearm for magazines, her rifle, 197 rounds, though she would only bring 3 magazines to save weight, her medical kit, her sleeping bag, and her logbook. She left the radios. She left the beacon. She left everything that couldn't help her survive the march ahead. The supply depot at Kessler Point was 18 miles southwest. Normally, that would be a day's hike over mountain terrain. After 8 days of isolation, inadequate food, and near total physical inactivity, it would be something closer to a death march. But it was the only option. Sarah checked her equipment one final time. She secured the outpost as best she could, sealing the door against the wind and the snow and the animals that would eventually come to investigate the strange structure wedged into the rock. Then she stepped outside. The cold hit her like a physical blow. Even with the storm gone, the temperature was well below zero. The wind was down to 15 knots, practically calm by the standards of the past week, but it still cut through her layers like a knife through paper. Sarah started walking. The descent from November-Seven to the valley floor took 11 hours. 11 hours of picking her way down frozen trails that the blizzard had transformed into death traps. 11 hours of watching for avalanche conditions, for unstable snow bridges, for the 1,000 ways a mountain could kill a person who wasn't paying attention. 3 times, she had to stop and dig herself out of snow that had given way beneath her feet. Twice, she heard the distant rumble of avalanches on adjacent slopes, close enough to send her heart racing, far enough to let her keep moving. Once, near the bottom of the steepest section, she slipped on an ice-covered rock and tumbled 30 feet before a snowbank caught her. She lay there for 5 minutes, checking for broken bones, checking for blood, checking for the kind of injury that would end her journey before it had really begun. Nothing. Bruises. A twisted ankle that screamed every time she put weight on it, but held. She kept moving. The valley floor was easier. Relatively. The snow was deep, waist-high in places, but was stable, and the terrain was flat, and she could see where she was going instead of trusting her feet to find purchase on invisible rock. Sarah walked. She walked as the sun climbed and began its descent. She walked as the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped and her body screamed at her to stop, to rest, to lie down in the soft snow and sleep. She didn't stop. She thought about Webb and Hoskins. She wondered if they were still alive, if the offensive had gone well, if they were warm and fed and safe in some forward operating base that had hot coffee and working radios. She thought about the convoy, the officers she had shot, the 300 soldiers who would have destroyed Rally Point Theta if she hadn't been there, if she hadn't been the best shot in the battalion, if she hadn't made a choice that no one had ordered her to make. She thought about the logbook in her pack. 6 words. The only record that any of it had happened, and she thought about what she would say when she reached Kessler Point, how she would explain where she had been, what she had done. She decided she wouldn't explain anything. Not really. She would report in, file the standard paperwork, submit her logbook for review, and let the bureaucracy sort out the rest. If they asked her about the Northern Canyon, she would tell them. If they didn't ask, she would stay silent. Some things weren't for the history books. Some things were just for you. The lights of Kessler Point Supply Depot appeared at 2,147 hours. Sarah had been walking for 17 hours. Her legs had stopped feeling like legs somewhere around hour 12. They were just columns of pain now, mechanical structures that moved because she told them to move, because stopping meant dying, because she hadn't survived 8 days of hell just to collapse half a mile from safety. The sentry saw her coming before she saw him. Halt! Identify yourself. Sarah's voice came out as a croak. She tried again, forcing the words through a throat that was raw from cold and dehydration. Corporal Sarah Vance. November 7th. I need to report in. The sentry stared at her. She could see him taking the state of her equipment, the ice in her hair, the look in her eyes that came from places most soldiers never went. November 7th? He checked something on his tablet, frowned, checked again. Ma'am, November 7th was decommissioned on March 14th. There's no garrison listed. I know, Sarah said. I was the garrison. The sentry called for backup. 2 more soldiers appeared, then a sergeant, then a lieutenant who looked like he had just been woken from a deep sleep and wasn't happy about it. They took her inside. They gave her hot coffee, then hot food, then a blanket that felt like the softest thing she had ever touched. A medic checked her vitals, clucked over her frostbitten fingers, wrapped her ankle in compression bandages, and told her she was lucky to be alive. Sarah knew. The lieutenant sat down across from her with a notepad and the expression of a man who was trying to decide whether he was dealing with a hero or a problem. "Walk me through it, Corporal. Start from the beginning." Sarah walked him through it. The departure of Webb and Hoskins, the blizzard, the dead radios, the dead beacon, the buried solar panels, the isolation, the cold. She didn't mention the convoy. Not yet. She wanted to see if they already knew. 8 days alone, the lieutenant said, scribbling notes. No communications, limited rations, extreme weather. And you decided to walk out instead of waiting for rescue. No one was coming, sir. The post doesn't exist on the maps anymore. If I had waited, I would have died waiting. The lieutenant nodded slowly. His expression had shifted from suspicion to something closer to respect. Commendable resilience, Corporal. We'll get you cleaned up, get you proper medical attention, get you back to your unit. He closed his notepad. Anything else I should know? Sarah looked at him for a long moment. Anything else? Anything else he should know? She could tell him. She could tell him about the convoy, about the 3 shots, about the flanking attack she had single-handedly stopped. She could demand recognition, demand investigation, demand that someone acknowledge what had happened in that canyon. But what would that accomplish? The convoy had withdrawn. The attack had been prevented. Rally Point Theta had held, 80 miles east, its defenders never knowing how close they had come to annihilation. That was a victory. That was what mattered. Not recognition, not medals, not her name in some after-action report that would gather dust in some archive somewhere. No, sir, Sarah said. Nothing else. The lieutenant nodded and stood. Get some rest, Corporal. You've earned it. He left. Sarah sat alone in the depot's mess hall, her hands wrapped around a cup of coffee that had gone cold, staring at nothing. Commendable resilience. That was what they would write in her file. Commendable resilience. She almost laughed. 3 days later, Sarah received orders transferring her to a training command in Colorado. The orders didn't mention November 7th. They didn't mention the blizzard. They certainly didn't mention the convoy, the shots, the choice she had made alone in the dark. They just assigned her to a new posting, effective immediately, with a note that her previous assignment had been administratively terminated. Sarah packed her gear and boarded the transport. She didn't look back. 2 weeks after Sarah Vance walked out mountains, the Coalition Command Staff held a briefing on the Northern Sector Offensive. The briefing included a detailed analysis of enemy movements, defensive positions, casualty reports, and tactical lessons learned. It covered every major engagement, every significant development, every factor that had contributed to the offensive's ultimate success. One item on the agenda was a brief discussion of enemy operational planning. Intelligence indicates, the briefing officer said, that hostile forces had planned a flanking maneuver through the northern mountains. Multiple vehicle columns were staged for an assault on Rally Point Theta's rear positions. The general in charge of the sector looked up from his notes. What happened to it? Weather, sir. Our analysis suggests they attempted to push through during the blizzard window, but were forced to abort due to conditions. So the storm stopped them. Yes, sir. The storm stopped them. The general nodded and moved on to the next item. No one in that room knew about Outpost November-Seven. No one knew about Corporal Sarah Vance. No one knew about the 3 shots that had decapitated the convoy's command structure, the 4 flares that had simulated a defended position, the single woman who had stood alone against 300 enemy soldiers and made them believe the ridge was too costly to take. The official record stated that the northern flanking attack had been defeated by weather. The official record was wrong. But the official record was all that would ever exist. Sarah arrived at her new posting on a Tuesday. The training center was nestled in the Colorado mountains, a sprawling facility where the next generation of military snipers learned their craft. It had heated barracks and functioning radios and a mess hall that served 3 hot meals a day. It felt like a different planet. Sarah's commanding officer was a captain named Reynolds, a former sniper himself who had spent 15 years in operational units before rotating to a training billet. He had the calm, patient demeanor of someone who had seen enough violence to last several lifetimes and now found satisfaction in teaching others how to survive it. "Vance," he said, looking over her personnel file. "You're the one from November 7th. "Yes, sir." Interesting posting. Decommissioned observation post. Solo garrison during a major blizzard. 8 days without communication. He set the file down. "And you walked out?" "Yes, sir." Reynolds studied her for a long moment. His eyes had the quality of someone who was seeing more than was being shown. "Your file says commendable resilience. That a phrase command uses when they don't quite know what to make of someone, when the story doesn't fit neatly into the usual boxes." Sarah said nothing. "I've seen your qualification scores," Reynolds continued. "Best shot in your battalion. Top percentile in distance accuracy, wind compensation, cold weather shooting." He paused. "You're being wasted as a training cadre member. You know, you should be operational." "I go where I'm sent, sir." "Yes." Reynolds leaned back in his chair. "You do. That's what soldiers do." He assigned her to the advanced marksman course, teaching long-range precision shooting to candidates who thought they knew everything and learned quickly that they didn't. Sarah was good at it. She was patient with the ones who struggled and demanding with the ones who coasted. She taught them how to read wind, how to calculate drop, how to find the stillness between breaths that turned a difficult shot into a certain one. She never told them about the canyon. She never told them about the 3 shots at 1,800, 1,900, and 2,000 yards. She never told them about the 7 to 8 second windows in 60-knot wind. She never told them about the choice she had made, alone, abandoned, with no one watching and no one to give her orders. Some lessons couldn't be taught. Some things had to be lived. Months passed. Sarah settled into a routine. Wake early. Run in the mountain air. Teach. Eat. Sleep. Repeat. She didn't think about November 7th very often. The memories were there, filed away in the same mental space where she kept all the things that were too heavy to carry daily. They would surface occasionally, when the wind picked up, when the temperature dropped, when she looked through a scope and saw terrain that reminded her of that frozen canyon. But mostly she let them rest. She had made her choice. She had done what was necessary. And the world had kept turning, oblivious of the single moment where one woman's decision had changed everything. That was enough. One evening, almost a year after the blizzard, Sarah was cleaning her rifle in the armory when a young candidate approached her. His name was Martinez, one of the more promising students in the current class. He had the marks of someone who might actually make it as a precision shooter: patience, focus, the ability to stay calm when everything was going wrong. "Corporal Vance?" Sarah looked up. "What is it, Martinez?" "Permission to ask you something, Corporal." "Go ahead." Martinez hesitated. He had the expression of someone wrestling with a question that felt too big for words. "How do you know when to take the shot?" Sarah set down her cleaning kit. "Elaborate. I mean, the instructors teach us all the technical stuff. Wind, drop, lead. But none of that matters if you don't pull the trigger. And sometimes I think about it. I'm lining up a shot on the range. Everything's perfect. And I start wondering what it would be like if it was real. If someone's life depended on whether I fired or not. And I don't know if I could do it." Sarah was quiet for a long time. She thought about the canyon, the storm, the convoy appearing out of the white void like something from a nightmare. She thought about the moment before she had fired, the weight of the choice, the knowledge that staying silent was the safest option, that firing would almost certainly mean her death, that no one would ever know if she failed to act. She thought about her finger on the trigger. 3 pounds of pressure. "You won't know until you're there," she said finally. "That's the truth of it. You can train for years, run 1,000 scenarios in your head, think you know exactly what you'll do when the moment comes. And then the moment comes and all of that goes away, and it's just you and the rifle and the choice." Martinez nodded slowly. "But what do you do?" In that moment, Sarah picked up her rifle and held it loosely, looking at the weapon that had saved her life and ended others. "You remember why you're there," she said. "You remember what you're protecting. You remember that the shot matters, even if no one else will ever know it mattered. And then you decide who you want to be." She set the rifle down. "The rest is just mechanics." Martinez thought about that for a while. Then he nodded again, thanked her, and left. Sarah returned to cleaning her rifle. She didn't think about November 7th, but somewhere in a storage facility in a military base she would never visit, her logbook sat in a box with other administrative detritus from decommissioned posts. And on one page, in her careful handwriting, 6 words contained everything. Day 6. Convoy attempted northern approach. Repelled. SV. The coalition never learned the truth about the northern sector offensive. They celebrated the victory at Rally Point Theta. They awarded medals to the commanders who had held the line. They wrote reports praising the soldiers who had fought and died, defending positions that should have been overrun. No one mentioned the flanking attack that never came. No one asked why the enemy's northern column had turned back. No one looked at the classified records from that period and noticed a gap. The missing reports from a post that didn't exist, the absence of communications from a garrison that had been erased, the silence where there should have been data. The war moved on. New offensives were launched. New victories were won. New soldiers rotated in to replace the ones who rotated out, and the institutional memory of individual events faded into the general blur of conflict. But the soldiers who had been at Rally Point Theta, the ones who had held the line without knowing how close they had come to destruction, some of them wondered. Late at night, in barracks and mess halls and quiet conversations over drinks, some of them talked about the Northern Canyon, the route that should have been used, the flanking attack that intelligence had predicted but that never materialized. Whether, they were told, the storm stopped them, and most of them accepted that explanation, but a few didn't. A few looked at the maps and the terrain and the enemy's operational patterns, and they didn't quite believe that weather alone had been enough. Something else had happened up there, something that didn't make it into the official reports. Someone had been watching. Someone had been waiting. Someone had done something that the records didn't show. Lieutenant Webb returned from the offensive with a scar across his left forearm and stories he didn't like to tell. He had been at Rally Point Theta during the worst of the fighting. He had seen friends die. He had killed men who were trying to kill him. He had done all the things that soldiers do in war and come out the other side with a particular look that combat veterans carry. The look of someone who had seen the elephant and learned that it was exactly as terrible as the story said. When he got back to his original unit, he asked about November 7th. Decommissioned, he was told. No current garrison. I know it's decommissioned. What happened to Corporal Vance? The admin clerk checked the records. Transferred to a training command in Colorado. March 27th. Webb did the math. That was 5 days after the blizzard had broken. 5 days after he had last stood in that stone outpost and told Sarah Vance that she was the best shot in the battalion. Was she extracted? Doesn't say. The clerk shrugged. Post was administratively terminated. Garrison status marked as concluded. That's all I've got. Webb stood there for a long moment, thinking about the blizzard that had raged across the northern mountains while he was fighting 80 miles east. Thinking about the woman he had left alone in a post that no one was watching. He thought about requesting her service records, getting a more complete picture of what had happened during those 8 days. Then he decided it wasn't his business. Sarah Vance was alive. She had been transferred to a new posting. Whatever had happened at November 7th during the blizzard, she had survived it. That was enough. Some stories weren't meant to be told. Some victories were invisible. Some soldiers did impossible things in places no one was watching, and the only reward was knowing they had done them. Webb understood that. He had his own stories he didn't tell. He wished Sarah well in silence and went on with his life. Months turned into years. The war continued. Other wars started. The military machine kept turning, chewing through resources and personnel with the same implacable hunger it always showed. Sarah Vance became a senior instructor, then a master instructor, then the head of the precision shooting program, responsible for training every long-range marksman who came through the facility. Her students won competitions. They deployed to operational theaters. They made shots that their targets never saw coming, from distances that shouldn't have been possible. Some of them died. That was the nature of the work. Precision shooters went to dangerous places and did dangerous things, and not all of them came back. Sarah attended the memorial services when she could. She stood in the back of the chapel or the hangar or the field where the boots and rifles were displayed, and she paid silent tribute to the people she had trained. She thought about how strange it was. She had sent these soldiers into the world with skills she had given them, skills she had honed in a frozen canyon where no one was watching. And those skills had saved lives and taken lives in ways she would never fully know. Her fingerprints were on every shot they took. Her teaching echoed in every trigger pull. And yet no one knew the story that had made her what she was. No one knew about the 3 shots, the flares, the convoy, the choice. That was fine. Some things weren't for sharing. Some truths were too personal to become stories, too sacred to be turned into lessons and anecdotes, and the kind of war stories that old soldiers traded over drinks. The convoy, the canyon, the blizzard, those belonged to her and her alone. The logbook stayed in its box in the storage facility. No one ever read it. No one ever pulled it from the shelf and opened it to the page where Sarah had written her 6 words. The record existed, technically, legally, somewhere in the vast bureaucratic archives of the military. But no one had any reason to look for it, and so it sat, undisturbed, gathering dust. Day 6. Convoy attempted northern approach. Repelled. SV. The truth of what happened that day. The real truth. The one that captured the moral weight and the physical impossibility and the sheer stubborn courage of what Sarah Vance had done. That truth lived only in her memory, and she was content with that. There were different kinds of recognition. There was the recognition that came from medals and citations and formal ceremonies, the public acknowledgement of extraordinary acts. And there was a recognition that came from within, from knowing that you had been tested and had not failed, that you had faced an impossible choice and made the right one. Sarah had the second kind. She would never have the first. And that was okay, because the defensive line at Rally Point Theta had held, because thousands of soldiers had survived an attack they never knew was coming, because the northern sector of the front had remained secure, and the offensive had succeeded, and the war had eventually wound down in the way that wars do. All of that had happened because of one woman, 3 bullets, and a choice made in the dark. The history books would never record it. But history wasn't the same as truth, and the truth was exactly what Sarah Vance knew it to be. 5 years after the blizzard, Sarah was promoted to Master Sergeant. The ceremony was small and dignified, the way these things usually were. Reynolds, now a colonel, pinned a new rank on her collar and shook her hand and said something about outstanding service and dedication to training the next generation. Sarah stood at attention and accepted the promotion with the quiet professionalism she had cultivated over decades of service. Afterward, Reynolds pulled her aside. "You know," he said, "I always wondered about your first posting. November 7th? The one that doesn't exist on any map I've ever seen. The one you walked out of during a blizzard." Reynolds studied her with those sniper's eyes that never miss anything. "Your record from that period is remarkably sparse. 8 days alone, no communications, extreme weather conditions. And then you just walk out, show up at a supply depot half frozen, but functional." Sarah met his gaze. "That's what happened, sir." "I'm sure it is." Reynolds paused. "I've been in this business a long time, Vance. I know what sparse records usually mean. They mean something happened that didn't fit neatly into any official narrative, something that command didn't quite know what to do with." Sarah said nothing. "The northern sector offensive," Reynolds continued. "I've studied that campaign. It was brilliant, strategically. We held positions we shouldn't have been able to hold. The enemy's flanking maneuvers all failed, even the ones that should have succeeded. Weather," Sarah said. "That's what the reports say." "Yes." Reynolds nodded slowly. "Weather. The blizzard that happened to hit at exactly the right time. The storm that happened to close exactly the routes the enemy was planning to use." His eyes held hers. "Weather is a wonderful explanation. It requires no investigation. It generates no medals. It leaves no loose ends." He paused. "And sometimes it's even true." Sarah didn't respond. Reynolds seemed to accept that. He clapped her on the shoulder, congratulated her again on her promotion, and walked away. Sarah watched him go. She thought about the canyon. The scope, the crosshairs settling on targets nearly 2,000 yards away. She thought about the choice. And she said nothing because there was nothing to say. The truth didn't need to be spoken to be true. It didn't need to be recognized to matter. It just needed to exist. And it did, in her memory, in the logbook, in the shape of a war that had gone differently because she had been there. That night, Sarah went for a walk in the mountains outside the training facility. The Colorado peaks were different from the ones where November 7th had stood. Warmer, friendlier, the kind of mountains that people hike for recreation rather than survived out of necessity. But mountains were mountains, and the sky above them was the same sky that had watched over her during the worst 8 days of her life. Sarah found a rock outcropping with a view of the valley below and sat down to watch the sunset. She thought about the young soldiers she had trained, the ones who would go out into the world with skills she had given them, the ones who would face their own impossible moments, their own choices, their own dark nights when no one was watching. She hoped she had taught them well, not just the technical skills, the wind reading, the ballistic calculations, the mechanics of precision shooting, but the other things, the harder things, the stuff that couldn't be quantified or tested. The willingness to act when action was costly. The courage to do what was right when no one was there to order you to do it. The understanding that some victories were invisible and that invisible victories were still victories. Those were the lessons that mattered. Those were the things that would keep soldiers alive and make them worthy of the trust placed in them. Sarah watched the sun sink below the mountains. The sky turned orange, then pink, then purple, then dark. Stars appeared. The same stars had been invisible above November 7th, hidden behind storm clouds and snow. But they had been there, even when she couldn't see them, even when the world was dark and she was alone and no one was coming. The stars had been there, and so had she. In her final year of service, Master Sergeant Sarah Vance wrote a training manual. It was titled Principles of Precision Marksmanship Under Extreme Conditions, and it became required reading for every sniper candidate who came through the program. The manual covered everything: cold weather shooting, high altitude ballistics, wind calculation in variable conditions, the physiological effects of stress on motor control. It was technical and detailed, and exactly the kind of resource that made complicated things comprehensible. But the final chapter was different. The final chapter was titled Moral Framework in Autonomous Operations. It discussed what happened when precision shooters found themselves alone, when communication failed, when orders couldn't reach them, when they faced decisions that would determine whether people lived or died, and no one was there to tell them what to do. Sarah wrote about the burden of autonomous choice. She wrote about the temptation to rationalize inaction. She wrote about the difference between a soldier who followed orders and a warrior who understood why those orders existed in the first place. She wrote about the moment when everything fell away, the chain of command, the operational plan, the comfortable certainty of being part of something larger, and all that remained was a person with a rifle and a choice. She didn't use any names. She didn't describe any specific operations. She didn't tell the story of November 7th or the convoy or the 3 shots that had changed the course of a war. But everyone who read that chapter could feel the weight of experience behind it. Everyone knew that this wasn't theoretical. This was someone who had been there. Sarah retired on a Thursday. There was a ceremony, of course. Colonel Reynolds, now General Reynolds, came out of his own retirement to attend. He stood at the podium and spoke about Sarah's contributions to the program, about the hundreds of soldiers she had trained, about the legacy she was leaving behind. Master Sergeant Vance, he said, represents the highest ideals of our profession. She has taught our people not just how to shoot, but how to think, how to decide, how to carry the weight of choices that most people will never have to make. He paused. Her service record says commendable resilience. I've always thought that phrase didn't quite capture it, but perhaps some things resist capture. Perhaps some acts of service are too large for the records we keep. He met Sarah's eyes across the room. Thank you, Master Sergeant, for everything you did, especially the things we don't know about. The audience applauded. Sarah accepted her retirement certificate, shook hands with the dignitaries, and walked out of the ceremony with the same quiet professionalism she had maintained throughout her career. She didn't make a speech. She didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. Sarah bought a small cabin in the mountains of Montana. It wasn't much, 2 rooms, a wood stove, a porch that looked out over a valley where elk grazed in the early morning mist. But it was hers, and it was quiet, and it was about as far from the world as a person could get while still having running water. She spent her days hiking, hunting when she needed meat, reading the books she had never had time for during her years of service, watching the sun rise and set over mountains that reminded her just enough, of the place where she had faced the most important decision of her life. Sometimes visitors came, former students, mostly young soldiers who were now experienced operators, who stopped by to pay their respects and share a drink and ask the questions they had never been brave enough to ask when she was their instructor. Sarah welcomed them. She answered what she could. And when they asked about her service, about the stories behind the training manual, about the experiences that had made her who she was, she smiled and shook her head. Some stories aren't for telling, she would say. Some things you just have to live. They understood, or they didn't. Either way, they respected her enough not to push. And then they would leave, and Sarah would return to her quiet life, and the world would keep turning without ever knowing what she had done. That was how she wanted it. That was enough. On the 20th anniversary of the Northern Sector Offensive, a military historian was going through archive records when she found something strange. A discrepancy in the operational maps. It was a minor thing, the kind of anomaly that most researchers would have overlooked. A post listed on pre-offensive planning documents, but absent from all subsequent records. A garrison notation without corresponding personnel files. A communication node that had apparently existed and then vanished without explanation. Outpost November-Seven. The historian, a meticulous academic named Dr. Chen, was intrigued enough to dig deeper. She found the administrative termination order. She found the personnel transfer records for the last 3 soldiers assigned to the post. She found a supply depot log noting the arrival of a single soldier on March 23rd. Condition: extreme cold exposure, dehydration, exhaustion. And she found a box in a storage facility. Inside the box was a logbook. Dr. Chen sat in the archives reading room and opened the logbook to the entry dated March 19th, day 6 of the blizzard. 6 words. Nothing else. Day 6. Convoy attempted northern approach. Repelled. SV. Dr. Chen stared at those words for a long time. She cross-referenced the date with enemy operational plans that had been captured after the war. She cross-referenced the location with terrain analysis. She cross-referenced the timing with the mysterious failure of the northern flanking attack that every historical account had attributed to weather. The pieces didn't quite fit, but they didn't quite not fit either. A convoy had attempted the northern approach. That matched the enemy's documented strategy, and it had been repelled. But not by weather. Weather would have been different. Weather would have been gradual, cumulative, a process of attrition. The enemy record showed something else. A sudden loss of command authority, a decision to withdraw, a reported defended position on the northern ridge. 1 soldier, alone in a blizzard, with a sniper rifle and 200 rounds of ammunition. Dr. Chen requested the full personnel file of the soldier, whose initials matched the logbook entry. She found Master Sergeant Sarah Vance, retired, last known address somewhere in the mountains of Montana. She wrote a letter. Sarah Vance received a letter on a Thursday morning in late October. She read it twice, then set it on her kitchen table and made herself a cup of coffee. Dr. Chen was asking to interview her for a book. A comprehensive history of the Northern Sector Offensive, one that would finally tell the complete story of that campaign, including, the letter emphasized, any classified or previously unknown operations that might shed light on certain discrepancies in the official record. Sarah looked out the window at the mountains. 20 years. 20 years since she had lain in the snow with her finger on the trigger and made a choice that no one had ever asked her to make. 20 years since the convoy had turned back. Since the defensive line had held, since the war had continued on a path shaped by 3 bullets that no history book had ever recorded. 20 years of silence. Sarah thought about what it would mean to speak, to finally tell the story, to have her name in a book, her actions documented, her choice vindicated, recognition. At last, she thought about it for a long time. Then she picked up a pen and wrote her response. Dr. Chen, thank you for your letter. I'm flattered by your interest in my service. Regarding November 7th and the events of March 19th, I have nothing to add to what is already in the official record. Weather conditions during that period were extreme. Any convoy attempting the northern approach would have faced significant challenges. I wish you well with your research. Sarah Vance. She sealed the letter and walked it down to her mailbox. The next morning, she went for a hike in the mountains. The air was cold and clean, the kind of cold that woke you up and made you feel alive. The aspens were turning gold and orange, painting the hillsides in colors that photographs could never capture. Sarah found her usual spot, a rocky outcropping with a view of the valley, and sat down to watch the sun rise. She thought about Dr. Chun and the book that would be written, the history that would finally, after 2 decades, try to account for discrepancies in the official record. Maybe someone would figure it out. Maybe some other researcher would connect the dots, would see the logbook entry for what it was, would understand that 6 words contained an entire battle. Maybe her story would be told after all, or maybe not. Maybe the silence would hold. Maybe the official narrative, weather conditions, bad luck for the enemy, would remain the accepted explanation forever. Either way was fine. Sarah watched the sun climb above the mountains. The light caught the ridgeline and set it glowing, orange and gold against the deep blue of the sky. Somewhere below, elk were moving through the valley, their breaths steaming in the cold air. It was peaceful. It was quiet. It was enough. Sarah Vance had spent her life learning how to wait, how to be still, how to find the calm center in the midst of chaos, and make the impossible shot. She had made the shot 20 years ago, alone in a blizzard, with no one watching and no one to give her orders. She had done what was necessary. She had done what was right. And then she had walked away and kept walking and built a life that had nothing to do with recognition or medals or the approval of people who would never understand. The truth was in the logbook. 6 words. The truth was in the lives saved. The defensive line that held. The thousands of soldiers who went home to their families because a convoy had turned back. The truth was in her. And that was enough. It had always been enough. Sarah sat on a mountainside and watched the world wake up, and she was at peace.